The phone clattered on the kitchen table, its shrill ring breaking the quiet like a whip. I glanced up from my book, an old habit when the world seemed too still. It was him. 4 years divorced, yet here he was, voice trembling with a plea about another temp job gone wrong. "You only know how to stay at home," he scoffed once, "never understand the world I live in." Funny. Here I was, best-selling author with my name in lights while he shuffled from gig to gig. I smiled, a slow, steady smile, one that said, "I'm far beyond your world now." Before we start, type 1 if you've ever dreamed of getting revenge but never got the chance. No judgment here, and hit that subscribe button. We don't let betrayal slide around here, not even from people who don't subscribe. Let's continue. I'm Florence McAllister, 35 years old, and if I may say so, a woman who's found her footing after years of scrambling in the mud. 4 years ago, I was Mrs. Clayton McAllister, wife and, as I learned, unpaid understudy to a man who thought his world was the only one that mattered. I'm telling you now, that sort of blindness has a way of sneaking up like a river flood, quiet at first, then sweeping everything away. My days back then were a mix of the ordinary and the endlessly frustrating. I worked from home as a freelance editor, turning other people's messy thoughts into something readable, while Clayton spent his hours muttering about opportunities and the real world. At night, I'd pore over manuscripts, the glow of my desk lamp my only companion. My life, if you squinted, looked peaceful, but it was a house built on thin ice. Clayton, well, he was a man with grand notions and a wallet that liked to stay empty. I remember the nights he'd come home late, shoulders heavy, eyes darting. Not the tired kind of heavy, but the kind that carries secrets. Once, when I asked about his day, he laughed too loudly and said, "You wouldn't understand, Florence. You live in your books, your safe little bubble." That laugh, too sharp, too brittle, was the first crack I noticed. But cracks are tricky. You can't just stare at them and hope they disappear. So I kept busy, more than busy, watchful, persistent in ways Clayton never guessed. When he slipped his phone into his pocket a little too quickly, I didn't ask. When the mail came with unopened envelopes addressed to another name, I filed them away in the back of the drawer like little puzzle pieces. My best friend, Ruth, was my anchor through it all. Ruth had a laugh that could fill a room and a nose for nonsense. "Florence," she said one Saturday afternoon while we sat on my porch, "you can't edit your way out of this one. You're watching a man drift and you're holding a pen. Sometimes you've got to get up and do something bigger." I looked at her then, saw the seriousness beneath the teasing smile. So I did. Not with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations, those never suited me. Instead, I began to thread a careful path, weaving my own safety net. I started reading more than manuscripts. I studied contracts, business news, anything about royalties and copyrights. My evenings grew longer as I turned pages of law books and financial guides. Ruth helped, too, slipping me articles she'd clipped from her newspaper or forwarding links to websites I'd never heard of. And Clayton. He carried on with his temporary jobs, a string of titles that barely lasted past payday. I'd hear the half-hearted excuses over the phone, the frustration dripping from his voice. One night he called to say, "I might have something steady now, but it's not the career I dreamed of." I said nothing, only listened. Behind that silence, I was stitching together the future I'd always wanted. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was preparing. Each manuscript I finished was a step away from the past, each book contract a brick in a new foundation. I cultivated small but important friendships with publishers and fellow writers who saw in me not just a freelancer, but a storyteller with something to say. And every time Clayton's voice echoed through the receiver, bitter or defeated, I was reminded that the world I live in, the one I carved out of ink and determination, was a world he'd never truly understand. But I'd show him. Not with anger or shouting, but with quiet strength, built over nights filled with the scratch of a pen and the soft rustle of turning pages. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time I was ready to walk it alone. The morning had dawned like any other, the sky a pale wash of blue, the air holding that crisp, hopeful chill that makes you want to throw open the windows and let the day rush in. I was at my desk, sipping the last dregs of black coffee, fingers poised above the keyboard, when the knock came sharp and insistent. Ruth was standing at the door, her face unreadable beneath the morning sun. "Florence, you need to see this," she said, clutching a thin envelope that looked far too official to be good news. I frowned, setting the coffee down, and took the envelope. The paper crackled in my hands, and with a breath I unfolded the letter inside. The words swam before my eyes, formal, cold, and absolute. Eviction notice, Ruth read over my shoulder, voice low. Apparently, the landlords decided not to renew your lease. They want the place cleared out in 30 days. 30 days, that's all the time I had to pack up a lifetime of late nights, rejections, and victories. My sanctuary, the walls that had witnessed the birth of every story, the scratch of every idea, was to be taken away without warning or compassion. I looked up at Ruth, who had never been one to mince words. They can't do this, I said, voice tight but steady. I've always paid my rent on time. She shrugged, doesn't always matter. Sometimes the world just decides to turn on you without reason. The irony wasn't lost on me. Clayton's world, the one he'd mocked, was shaking beneath my feet. And yet, as the letter sat heavy in my hand, I felt no despair. Not yet. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting in the dim light of a local cafe, laptop open but forgotten, a cup of tea growing cold beside me. My phone buzzed. Clayton. Florence, his voice cracked, rough around the edges. I heard about your lease. If you need a place, I could. I cut him off gently. No, Clayton, I'll manage, thank you. There was silence, then a bitter laugh. Always so independent, you always were. I learned from the best, I said softly, hanging up before the sting of his words could settle. As the days passed, I reached out to friends, to contacts, to anyone who might offer a lifeline. Ruth showed up with stacks of boxes, her laughter filling the empty spaces as we packed. You're not just moving house, Florence, she said, you're moving on. On a particularly bleak afternoon, when the weight of uncertainty pressed hardest, I found myself standing before a tiny bookstore in town. The owner, a wiry man named Harold who always greeted me with a knowing smile, looked up as I stepped inside. Florence, he said, brushing dust from a shelf, I hear you're looking for a new place to spin your tailies. I nodded, biting back the weariness. I am. He considered me for a moment, then said, there's a vacant space above the shop. Small but warm, cheap too. Hope fluttered in my chest. Really? Harold smiled, don't thank me yet. But it's yours if you want it. That evening, as Ruth and I sat surrounded by half-packed boxes, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The road ahead was rougher than I'd imagined, but I wasn't alone. Florence, Ruth said, eyes bright, this is just another chapter, not the end. I looked around at the chaos, the scattered papers, the stacked books, and felt a fierce determination grow. Whatever storms were coming, I would face them head-on, armed with words and will. And deep down, I knew Clayton's world, the one built on fleeting jobs and empty promises, was beginning to crumble, while mine was being rebuilt, stronger and brighter with every challenge met and overcome. The small office above Harold's bookstore quickly became my refuge, a snug, dusty haven with peeling wallpaper and a creaky wooden floor that whispered secrets with every step. It was a far cry from the spacious apartment Clayton had once called home, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, that word felt weighty and true. I settled into the rhythm of this new life with the precision of a clockmaker. Morning light would spill through the thin curtains, dust motes dancing like tiny specters in the quiet air. I found comfort in the mundane, the hum of the kettle, the scent of ink and paper, the tactile thrill of a freshly printed manuscript. But beneath the daily grind, a plan was unfolding, slow and deliberate, like the winding of a great machinery. It started one morning when Ruth dropped by, her arms laden with bags. Florence, you're not just going to sit here and stew, she said, tossing a pile of newspapers onto my cluttered desk. Time to dig a little deeper. I nodded, pulling the papers toward me. Business reports, public notices, columns about local temp agencies, anything that might offer a glimpse into the chaos Clayton seemed to court. Look here, Ruth said, pointing to a small notice buried on page 7. That temp agency he's been hopping through, filed for bankruptcy last month, could explain why he's been calling you all frantic-like. I frowned, folding the paper and tucking it into my folder. It was one piece of a larger puzzle, one I was starting to assemble with care. Days passed like this, calls with publishers, meetings with lawyers, visits to city offices where I learned to navigate the labyrinth of leases and contracts with a surgeon's steadiness. I was no stranger to persistence, but this was a new kind of fight. Not for art, but for survival. Harold, ever the reluctant ally, poked his head in one afternoon. You're spending a lot of time on that phone, Florence. I smiled without looking up, making sure my footing's solid. He grunted approvingly. Good, a woman's got to know when to hold her ground. Meanwhile, the threads of Clayton's life began to unravel in ways even he couldn't control. One evening, my phone lit up with a message from an unfamiliar number. A picture of a crumpled paycheck from a job I hadn't known he'd taken. The amount was pitiful, barely enough to cover a week's rent anywhere decent. I forwarded the image to Ruth. "Still chasing ghosts," she muttered, shaking her head, but there was more beneath the surface. Whispers from old acquaintances, offhand comments about Clayton borrowing money, dodging calls, and disappearing when debts came knocking. I filed each tidbit away, not as fuel for anger, but as evidence of a man sinking under the weight of his own making. One afternoon, as I sorted through a box of old mail left behind in the apartment, a thick envelope slipped out, bearing the logo of a prestigious publishing house. Inside was a letter addressed to Clayton, thick with legalese about unpaid advances and breaches of contract. Ruth whistled low. "He's in deeper than we thought." I tucked the letter away carefully. It wasn't just about Clayton's failures anymore, it was about the cost of those failures, the trail of wreckage left behind. But I was no longer the woman who'd stood silent while her world crumbled. I was gathering strength and truth like a winter's firewood, each piece dry and ready to ignite. At night, after Ruth left and the world outside quieted to a hush, I'd sit at my desk, arranging the fragments of this story into a tapestry of justice. There was a letter from the landlord confirming the eviction notice, a record of Clayton's disappearing paychecks, a ledger from a temp agency listing his late or missed shifts. I wasn't just collecting facts, I was constructing a fortress around my future. One evening, Ruth leaned over my shoulder as I spread documents across the table. "You're building a case," she said softly. I glanced up, a quiet smile tugging at my lips. "And soon he'll realize I'm not the one who's been lost." The days stretched on, each bringing new pieces to the puzzle. I met with a sharp-eyed attorney named Miss Caldwell, whose reputation for taking on the impossible was well known. "Florence," she said during our first meeting, "you have more than just stories here. You've got leverage." Her words struck a chord, stirring a resolve I hadn't dared to name. I left the office that day with a folder thicker than any manuscript I'd ever edited. It was a roadmap out of the shadows, a testament to a woman who refused to be undone. Clayton's world, built on shifting sands and whispered promises, was crumbling, but mine, like the stories I told, was coming to life in bold, unyielding strokes. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, I knew the moment of reckoning was drawing near. The morning of the confrontation was crisp and clear, the kind of day that promises a reckoning as sure as the sun's climb over the rooftops. I dressed with a quiet determination, selecting a simple, dark dress that fit like armor and laced my boots tight, not for battle but for standing firm. Ruth waited at the cafe near the courthouse, her usual laughter tempered with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "Florence," she said, gripping my hand as I joined her, "you look ready to take the whole world on." "I intend to," I replied, the words tasting like a solemn vow. We sat with our coffee growing cold between us, the buzz of the city swelling around us like a chorus before a grand symphony. My phone vibrated once. Clayton's name flashed on the screen, but I let it ring out. Today wasn't for distractions. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and tension. My attorney, Miss Caldwell, greeted me with a reassuring nod and a brief squeeze of my shoulder. "Ready, Florence." I smiled a steady, calm smile, as I'll ever be. The courtroom filled slowly, faces I recognized from the past and strangers who belonged only to the present moment. Then, Clayton arrived. His suit was ill-fitting, the collar too loose, his eyes flickering with a cocktail of anger and confusion. He spotted me and stiffened, as if seeing a ghost that refused to stay buried. The judge called the room to order and the proceedings began. Clayton's attorney spoke first, attempting to paint a picture of a man who had struggled, yes, but who deserved a chance at redemption. But I was prepared. When my turn came, Miss Caldwell laid out the evidence with precision and clarity: the unpaid advances, the eviction notices, the temp agency records. She spoke not just of facts, but of betrayal and broken promises, of a life built on fragile foundations. Clayton's face shifted through shades of disbelief, frustration, and, finally, resignation. Then came my moment. I stood, voice clear and steady, addressing the room. For years, I was told I didn't understand the world Clayton lived in. That I was sheltered, naive, trapped in a bubble of books and dreams. A murmur rippled through the spectators, but I pressed on. Today, I stand before you not as someone sheltered, but as someone who has fought to reclaim her life from the wreckage left behind. My world is one of words, yes, but also one of action, of resilience. Clayton's lips twitched, perhaps to retort, but Miss Caldwell gently raised a hand. I continued, This isn't about vengeance, it's about accountability. About ensuring that the past does not dictate the future. The courtroom held its breath. After hours that felt like days, the judge finally delivered a ruling, one that acknowledged the truths laid bare and upheld my rights. Clayton would be responsible for the debts incurred, and I was granted security over my living space and royalties owed from my work. As the gavel struck, a weight lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a fierce lightness. Outside, Ruth pulled me into a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered. "I did," I agreed. Clayton lingered nearby, his face a mask of defeat. Our eyes met briefly, and in that glance I saw the man who once mocked my world, now a shadow fading into the past. Walking away from the courthouse, the city felt different, brighter, broader. The future was mine to write, and this time I held the pen. The morning sun poured through the window of my little office above Harold's bookstore, casting long shadows across the scattered papers and half-finished drafts. I sat at my desk, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hands, as the reality of what had just unfolded still settled into my bones. The courthouse ruling wasn't just a victory on paper, it was a turning point, a launching pad into a new chapter I'd fought long and hard to write. "Florence," Ruth's voice called from the doorway, bright as a summer's day. She bounced into the room, waving a freshly printed newspaper. "Look at this, your latest book just made it onto the bestseller list. Front page, no less." I took the paper from her, eyes scanning the bold headline. There it was, my name, in letters big enough to fill the whole city square. A mix of pride and disbelief fluttered in my chest. I traced the words with a trembling finger. "That's something, isn't it?" I murmured. Ruth laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Something, it's everything. You've got the world at your feet, Florence." But beneath the celebration, a quiet resolve stirred. The fight was far from over. The courthouse decision had cleared a path, yes, but the true work lay in walking it steadily, with grace and grit. I spent the following week steering my life back on course with meticulous care. The eviction notice was withdrawn, thanks to the judge's ruling, and Harold's office became less of a refuge and more of a headquarters. Contracts were revisited and renegotiated, payments came through with newfound regularity, and the royalties began to trickle, then flood, into my accounts. One afternoon, as I reviewed correspondence from my publisher, a knock sounded at the door. Harold poked his head in, carrying a box. "Thought you might want some company," he said with a grin. "And maybe a little extra light." Inside the box was a small lamp, antique, with a stained glass shade that painted the room in warm colors. I smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Harold, it's perfect." He shrugged, modest. "You've earned it." The days grew busier, filled with interviews, book signings, and the kind of calls that no longer made me flinch. Ruth stayed by my side through it all, her friendship a constant thread woven through the fabric of my new life. One evening, as we shared a quiet dinner in my modest kitchen, Ruth leaned back and sipped her wine. "You know, Florence, you haven't just changed your address, you've changed everything." I nodded, stirring my tea thoughtfully. It took losing a lot to find what I truly wanted. She raised her glass, to losing then to finding. To both, I agreed. Meanwhile, news trickled in about Clayton's struggles. The man who once sneered at my world was now tangled in debts and missed opportunities, his temp jobs dwindling to nothing. A former colleague mentioned he'd been seen at a homeless shelter, face gaunt and weary. I heard it with a strange mixture of pity and relief. There was no satisfaction in another's fall, only the quiet peace of having risen above it. The transformation in my own life was undeniable. Financial stability granted me freedom, and with it, the courage to dream bigger. I hired an assistant to manage correspondence, freeing me to focus on writing. My publisher offered a contract for a new book, one that would tell not just stories but truths born of experience. One morning, as I prepared notes for a forthcoming interview, Ruth burst into the room, eyes wide with excitement. "Florence, you've got to hear this. The local community center wants you to speak at their upcoming women's empowerment event." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I think I'd like that." Ruth clapped her hands together. "Good, because it's time to share your story, not just the bestseller parts but the battle, the scars, the victory." I paused, considering the weight of those words. The journey from the shadows to the spotlight wasn't just mine, it was a beacon for others who might find themselves lost. That night, as I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker to life, I felt a profound sense of balance. The fight had changed me, shaped me into someone stronger, wiser. The past no longer held chains, it held lessons. And as the stars blinked above, I whispered into the quiet room, this is only the beginning. The morning mist hung low over the city, lending a certain hush to the streets that felt almost like a reprieve. I stepped out of Harold's bookstore, the weight of the past months settling comfortably on my shoulders. Not as a burden, but as proof that the hardest battles bore the sweetest victories. The news had traveled fast, though not in the way I might have wished. Clayton's name had started appearing in whispered conversations and half-shielded glances. I'd caught a snippet at the cafe, someone murmuring about his latest failed attempt at a temp job, the one where he'd walked out after 2 days, citing unfair treatment. Another acquaintance, passing through town, had shared a story of a scuffle at a local shelter, where Clayton had argued with staff over petty grievances. Ruth and I sat in my modest living room, the afternoon sun spilling through lace curtains as we sipped tea. She leaned in, voice low with concern. I heard he's behind on rent again. And there's talk of a lawsuit from the temp agency for unpaid fees. I nodded, folding the tea towel thoughtfully. He's unraveling. But Ruth added, eyes searching mine, does that trouble you? I smiled, a soft curl of lips that held years of lessons. No, Ruth, there's a difference between trouble and consequence. He's facing the results of choices he made long ago. Outside, the city thrummed with life, indifferent to one man's fall but ready to embrace another's rise. My own life had shifted in ways I was only beginning to understand. The book tour had grown longer, invitations more frequent. Each autograph signed felt less like a duty and more like a declaration. This woman, once silenced, now had a voice that reached far beyond the confines of a small apartment or a dusty office. One evening, as I returned from a speaking engagement, Harold was waiting by the bookstore door, a knowing smile beneath his graying mustache. "You're making waves, Florence," he said, handing me a freshly printed newspaper. "The editors got an article about you in the Sunday edition." I flipped through the pages, the words glowing like embers on the printed page. They spoke of resilience, of triumph, of a woman who transformed heartbreak into art and hardship into hope. "It's a fine piece," Harold remarked, folding the paper neatly. "But remember, it's your story, not theirs." "Always," I replied. Days later, my phone rang with news from my publisher. The royalties from my latest book had surpassed all expectations, enough to secure the future I'd once only dreamed of. I booked an appointment with a financial advisor, eager to learn how to nurture this newfound stability. At the meeting, Mr. Jenkins, a sharp-eyed man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, laid out a plan. "Miss McAllister, with your income and growing audience, you're positioned to build a legacy. Investments, savings, even charitable giving if you wish." I listened intently, the gears turning. For years, survival had been my only goal. Now I was talking about prosperity, about generosity. Afterward, Ruth met me for dinner at our favorite bistro. "You're thinking big," she said, raising an eyebrow. "I'm thinking smart," I corrected with a smile. "It's time to give back, to help other women who might find themselves where I once was." Her eyes sparkled. "That's the Florence I know." Meanwhile, legal matters with Clayton continued to unfold. His mounting debts caught the attention of creditors, and a judge ruled in my favor to secure outstanding royalties and reimbursements. One afternoon, as I sat in the lawyer's office, Miss Caldwell handed me the final documents with a satisfied nod. "This should close the chapter on his claims," she said. "You're free to move forward without fear of financial entanglements." Relief washed over me, steady and profound. I folded the papers carefully, feeling the weight of freedom. Back at home, Ruth and I toasted with glasses of sparkling cider. "To endings," she said. "And to beginnings," I replied. The years of struggle, the moments of doubt, the quiet preparations, they all led to this. A life reclaimed, a future shaped by courage and clarity. As night fell and the city lights blinked awake, I stood by the window, feeling the pulse of a world that was finally mine to explore. Clayton's shadow had faded, replaced by the bright, unyielding glow of a woman who refused to be defined by her past. And with that light came a promise. Whatever storms may come, I would meet them with the strength of a story well told and a heart that knew the true meaning of resilience. The sun was setting slow that evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, as if the world itself wanted to mark the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. I stood by the window of my office, the little lamp Harold gifted casting soft patterns on the worn wooden floor. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual life, but inside there was a calm I'd never known before. Ruth bustled in, fresh from her evening walk, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. "Florence," she said, dropping a bundle of mail on my desk, You've got invitations coming in faster than I can keep up. Speaking gigs, book fairs, even a charity event for women's shelters. I laughed softly, the sound lighter than it had been in years. Seems I've become quite the busy bee. She grinned, plopping into the chair beside me. And you wear it well. You're more than just a best-selling author now, you're a beacon. Her words warmed me more than the fire crackling in the hearth. It wasn't just about books or money anymore. It was about standing tall, about owning my story without apology or fear. Later, as we sat sharing a quiet supper, Ruth leaned back and regarded me thoughtfully. Remember when you used to say he only knew how to stay at home, never understanding your world? I nodded, the memory sharp but distant. Well, look at you now. You've built a world so vast and vibrant that even the skeptics can't ignore it. I smiled, lifting my glass. Here's to never settling for less than we deserve. The months rolled on, each day weaving new threads into the tapestry of my life. I mentored young women at the community center, sharing lessons not found in textbooks, lessons of grit, resilience, and self-worth. Harold's bookstore became a hub for local writers and dreamers, a place where stories blossomed amid the scent of old paper and fresh ink. One rainy afternoon, as I helped a young woman leaf through a stack of manuscripts, Ruth called from the doorway, excitement bubbling in her voice. "Florence, you should see this. A letter from a literary agent in New York. They want to represent you." The room seemed to hold its breath. I took the letter gingerly, reading the words that promised a future even brighter than I'd dared imagine. "That's the kind of news that calls for celebration," Ruth declared, grabbing my hands in hers. We toasted with chipped mugs of steaming tea, laughter spilling freely between us. Still, I never forgot the journey. The nights spent unraveling tangled lies, the quiet strength gathered in the shadows, the fierce resolve that carried me through. Each challenge was a stepping stone, every setback a lesson etched deep in my soul. One evening, as I locked up the bookstore, I glanced at the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. The world was wide and wild, full of stories waiting to be told. I'd spent years finding my voice, but now I was ready to listen as well, to the whispers of dreams yet dreamt, to the possibilities unfolding just beyond the horizon. Ruth joined me outside, looking up at the velvet sky. "What's next for Florence McAllister?" I shrugged, a smile playing on my lips. "Whatever I choose. The pen's in my hand now." And with that, we walked into the night, two friends stepping boldly toward the open future. A future forged not in sorrow, but in strength, wisdom, and the unshakable belief that even after the darkest storms, the sun always rises again.